So this week we switched to English. Last week we had another Brit, but partly French, so he talked French. Tom Emerson.
Yeah.
And this week we are really proud and to invite Sam Jacob. You know maybe his work, even despite the fact it's a kind of heretic. At least we're not in Lausanne. Heretic, because of course Sam belongs to this, but it's much more interesting than this. But to make it short, let's say it's often classified in the kind of radical postmodernism, but it's for us, we don't care about this. What interests us in the field of this economy of means cycle, it's of course that the fact that when you look at the Sam's work, at first sight, of course, you don't think we should invite him in such economy of means cycle. But this would be true if we would just stay to this, let's say, a bit narrow definition of economy of means, that only think that economy of means is using as few means as possible to reach a specific goal. Of course, economy of means, it's this, but beyond this, economy of means, of course, as we have already discussed, is describe any attitude that has a critical approach towards the means that are used to make something. So from that point of view, the fact that Sam's work really questions the issue about expression of architecture, in which way architecture can communicate, in which way architecture can create images, in which way any good building has a strong image, in which way ornament can still be... What's this? In which way architecture can... ornament can be a relevant issue for today, in which way the, let's say, dry, seemingly objective modernity can be criticized today, in which way the boring, expensive, and not at all economic in means in any way of the most of the contemporary Swiss architecture, for example, and the seemingly minimalistic architecture can be criticized, in which way the production also of some other maybe British practices, like Caruso's engine, for example, are also involved in ornament in maybe a kind of postmodernist way. Sometimes you wonder if it's conscious or unconsciously. Of course, Sam has his place here because he has a super critical approach about ornament, about decoration, about image, about the way in which architecture can communicate. So the fact he has this so critical approach towards those issues can allow him to go far beyond in a seemingly heretic direction. And by assuming, I mean heretic compared to the religion of modernity, and can allow him to go quite far in the questioning of those issues. That's why he has absolutely his place here in this cycle, despite appearances, and we are really proud and pleased to have you here. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Eric. And it's great to be here. Yeah, I mean, first up, all the projects I'm going to show you are, relatively speaking, as far as architecture can be, cheap in a straightforward way. But it was interesting talking about this idea of economy of means in the taxi. Not the cheapest way to get here, I imagine, but a economy of time in that case. And I suppose one of the things that has sort of characterized the work that I've been involved in over the last like 20 years or something, first with FAT and now in a kind of solo career, is an idea of like really a question of like what architecture is made of. Not exactly in a material sense, but in a more conceptual sense. Or, I suppose, to phrase the question in another way, like, what does architecture make? Like, we know it makes buildings for sure, but of course it's involved in the production of a whole set of other things, from ideas to cities. And somehow I think the work sits somewhere between those things. So thinking about what the means of your practice has been really kind of key to my work. And I think one of the other things that characterizes this approach is an idea of, well, this, which is not the advertised title of the talk, but and what might I mean by that? Well, here's just a few selections: recontextualizing, reconstruction, representation, reenactment, remaking, replays, redo, and just And I think this is interesting because it's always about referring to something else, in some sense, so that this figures architecture never as something which sits outside of culture, circumstance, history, but always something which is like fully engaged with, well, the things that you choose for it to be engaged with. And in that sense, circumstance becomes a kind of medium in and of itself. I mean, this is also the that you get in an email chain, you know, like and it's not an abbreviation of like reply or regarding, but it's Latin, it's proper Latin, and it means thing or circumstance or kind of about or concerning or regarding. And so I think in that sense, this is a way of like trying to contextualize the work within like wider settings, wider cultural settings of how you might understand architecture, what you might understand an architectural project to be, what it might mean to practice as an architect, rather than assume those definitions as given to you by like the profession or by kind of standard ways of operating. But it also, I think, refers to other ideas within architecture. Now, like one weird obsession that architects have had, like since the beginning, is what is the beginning, like the origin. Where did architecture come from? As if it was impossible to imagine that something like architecture could just emerge. And so there's of course there's many stories about where the origin of architecture is, and you know, one story is Vitruvius's story that the column is really a tree, and that if you follow that logic, then the Doric temple is a stone Doric temple is really a kind of stone reconstruction or reenactment of a timber building, and so that there's always the thing, but there's the imaginative idea of what that thing was before it was architecture. You could say the same of the primitive hut, where kind of architecture emerges out of the natural. Here's another story. This is Adolf Loos's story. So he writes in his essay, Architecture, and he's talking about what's this weird sound effect? I'm kind of enjoying it. Yeah. I don't know if you guys are.
It's made by purpose. When you're too long.
Yeah, it goes straight into my brain. So Adolf Loos, he's like talking really about the kind of what is architecture, how terrible architecture is, in his usual kind of extreme manner. And he writes about this. This is one passage, and he's talking about going into a forest, and he writes, "When we come across a mound in the wood, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, raised in a pyramidal form by means of a spade, we become serious, and something in us says, somebody lies buried here. This is architecture." So there's a few things happening there. One I'll get onto in a second. But Loos is also saying that architecture is something which you come across. Like it's a thing which already exists, and it kind of like becomes architecture in your encounter with it. And I think all of these ideas of like where did architecture come from, of course they're all myths. None of them are true, and it's not about their truth. It's about, I guess, a conception of how architecture figures within a wider context of like why, philosophical questions, why are we here, what are we doing, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to show some projects which deal with the act of essentially dealing with history, reenactments, recreations, and other kinds of relationships to history. And the first is very directly related to this, which is the tomb that Adolf Loos designed in 1921, but never built. And it's one of those projects which, a never built project, which nevertheless is quite canonical, like exists as an important moment in architectural history. Something, of course, which should tell us that architecture is not about building. Architecture is about the production of architecture. But this is clearly a design for something which is permanent, heavy, masonry, like all of the things you would associate with things which talk to endless amounts of time. And for a very kind of small festival in a very grand cemetery in London, we reconstructed it, but reconstructed it in the most kind of lightweight and simple way that we could. So this is a one-to-one model as far as we could work out, because the documentation of the original project is pretty hazy, so you can't really, you have to scale from it and make some assumptions. But it's set in a cemetery, and it becomes a kind of monument almost to itself, I suppose, or a kind of ghostly resurrection, like all of the things which the original proposed, like heaviness, like duration of time, are kind of exactly the opposite. This was up in this location for, I think, 3 days. I mean, it took like, I don't know, 2 weeks to build it. It then re-emerged as the centerpiece of an opera performance, and is currently becoming a chicken shed in a farm in the west of England, which is, I would say, a pretty interesting life for something which thought it was the ghost of a mausoleum. But it also suggests that maybe there's something in that reinterpretation which allows architecture to perform in a whole set of other ways. I suppose like this is another way of working really directly with the past. So what I'm showing here is like a kind of jug, clearly. The top of the jug is, it's like 200 BC, piece of like classical pottery, and the bottom is a kind of suggestion of a jug, like it's jug-like. Whether it could work like a jug, I'm not sure. But its shape tries to imitate, but show its imitation of the idea of a jug. And in its composition, it kind of makes a thing which has been fragmented for like two millennia into something whole again. It's part of a pair of pieces. I'll show you the other in a second. And they're called a false description of the thing destroyed, which is a phrase stolen from Ruskin, who talks about his kind of like his absolute horror at the idea of architectural reconstruction. Ruskin writes that this is about restoration and reconstruction, maybe an idea that you might want to think about in relation to Notre Dame. He says, it means the most total destruction which a building can suffer. a destruction out of which no remnants can be gathered, a destruction accompanied with false description of the thing destroyed, false also in the manner of parody, the most loathsome manner of falsehood. And in a sense, this is the description of the false, a false description of the thing destroyed. It is the most loathsome manner of falsehood, and in some ways, I suppose, these are sometimes these are the kinds of ideas which are interesting to address, I would say, or at least return kind of design solutions against. This is the other version, a Greek plate. So the kind of white and pink stuff is this stuff called Fimo. You get it in like art shops. You usually do it with your kids, like make a little penguin, and you can bake it in the oven and it goes solid. So it's a kind of a material with almost no quality whatsoever. It has no texture. It has no kind of, like, there's no patina to it. It's just like modern plastic. And so the kind of combination of a thing which carries with it like history and heritage and culture with a thing which has exactly none of those qualities was, I guess, central to the project. More forms of reconstruction. And I suppose what I'm trying to get across here is like the way in which like things being remade is actually a way of bringing new ideas into the world. And I suppose one might contrast that with a more straightforward idea of what originality might be, which I think has got a kind of, in architecture, has a kind of legacy that goes back to the beginning of the modern period, where an idea of individual expression becomes important within architecture. Before that, you have a kind of a much more like widely accepted idea of what architecture is doing in terms of its language, in terms of the references and culture that it represents. With modernism, an idea of individual expression becomes absolutely central, and I think that's exactly what you saw, the kind of maybe the last gasps of in the period of like 2000 to 2015, maybe a bit longer, 1995, maybe beginning with Bilbao, ending, well, it's kind of ending maybe as we speak. And the other ideas of what it means to practice, how an idea is brought into the world, I think are becoming much more common and much more interesting. Interesting because they don't refer simply to themselves, that they always refer to a whole set of other ideas. I mean, what I'm showing you here is a very ordinary terraced house in London. And what I want you to look at is the railings at the front. Now, the railings at the front, like all of these buildings were built by spec developers. And they were built as cheaply as possible. And in order to give them apparent character and give them desirability, they kind of added various bits of decoration. And one of the bits of decoration you see all across London is these railings, which are on the whole pretty straightforward, but then they have little moments of kind of classical expression, particularly things like this, like an urn on the corner, that turns the corner. Now, this also happens to be the house where Lenin stayed when he was staying in London. So there's a kind of biographical quality to this particular finial on this railing. You can see also that it's a kind of debased form of historical reference, debased in that it's a classical urn, but it's been reduced to a kind of size which is pretty cheap to reproduce. It's been kind of maintained, but in a not a particularly careful way. It's had a layer of paint, dent, another layer of paint, scratches, and over the course of, say, 100 years, 120 years, its kind of form has grown and become something which is less controlled. So a very, you could say, debased idea, or a debased like version of what was once a grand reference. And this project involved simply the reproduction of that object, but a very careful reproduction of it. So it was a 3D scan, which was then blown up. So it's something like this big on the railing, and that thing is like this big. And when it gets that big, it also reproduces all of the wear and tear and layers of paint and kind of accidents which have happened to that object. But what it's also doing is returning the scale of that object back to an urn size. So it sort of tries to unravel the history of this decorative element while also recognizing the very specific qualities that decorative element has itself. Like it's both an urn and also not an urn. I mean, in a sense, it's accidental that it happens to be Lenin's house. It's really because of the kind of formal, actual qualities of that thing. But I guess it's also interesting, the title of this is Lenin's Urn, is that, of course, Lenin is embalmed, like he's not in an urn. So there's a kind of irony to that. Like, we were interested in this idea of what 3D scanning could do. And we were interested in the way in which it could interrogate history and produce maybe kind of like new forms which have a kind of relationship to things which are incredibly ancient. So having done that little experiment, we decided to take on a much larger object and a kind of much larger idea, I suppose. So this is Avebury, which is a stone circle in the west of England, very near to Stonehenge. And some say more important than Stonehenge in Neolithic culture, although how anyone knows. It's an amazing place, partly because over time it's had a village built in it, so you get like standing stones which turn into a pub. So the kind of overlaps of history are much more complex than they are in a kind of more carefully preserved monument. This is one of the stones, and you can see others heading off into the landscape. This is called the barber surgeon stone because it fell over once, crushing someone who was a barber surgeon. Back in the day, people who had sharp implements clearly were able to use their skills in many ways, so they could cut your hair and they could perform surgery for you. And so we began to 3D scan this particular stone. And I thought I'd show you these. These are the accidents of scanning. This is like us not being very good at doing something. I suppose, unlike an archaeologist, we're much more interested in the translation, the kind of translation of information from one state to another, from like actual piece of like, you know, kind of human history to a digital state. So these kind of like almost like kind of like silk scarves like caught in the wind, where we're not understanding how the software is supposed to interpret what it's looking at. But of course they produce these very weird effects, which for us are exciting because there's something between a kind of examination of something like prehistoric, literally prehistoric, but through the lens of the technological. And kind of these mistakes, I suppose, are things which are absolutely out of control. However, it wasn't what we were trying to do. So this just gives you a glimpse into the world of photogrammetry, where you use flat image, just a normal camera, to take pictures around an object, and the software then manages to position each image in relation to each other, and then produce a 3D image from that, a 3D model from that set of photographs. So it's like an amazing thing. But that was all in the service of a sculpture placed in the central road in Milton Keynes. And if Tom was here last week, you must have all heard a lot about Milton Keynes, the last of the British new towns, and a place which, on the one hand, is inspired by kind of high modernism, shopping centre, as I'm sure you've seen, which is incredibly Miesian. A grid borrowed from an American city, the kind of British love of Los Angeles, particularly in the early 1970s, but also mixed up with a kind of stories and ideas which are like a hippie's idea of New Age culture. So this road that this sculpture is on is called Midsummer Boulevard, and it runs from it's very prosaic, it runs from the train station to the shopping centre, but on Midsummer's Day every year, the sun rises on axis on this boring road, just like it does at places like Stonehenge. And it was clearly part of the design team's kind of dream that a modern piece of urban planning could also resonate with these kinds of histories. What we were doing was remaking one of those, a kind of a one-to-one, a piece of Neolithic culture, but treating it in the manner of a 1970s custom car. So it's sprayed with the kind of paint that when you look at it from a different angle, it changes colour. So in a sense, it was a monument to that moment in time where urban planning could be interested in flashy cars and like ancient history simultaneously. But maybe in a wider sense, it's also about the kind of the gaps which exist in history. This is other people looking at exactly that same topic. This is Inigo Jones, like really the first British architect, the one who kind of learned how to do architecture in Italy and built the first kind of Palladian building in England. But this was him as the king's surveyor looking at Stonehenge. And when he saw Stonehenge, he saw a Roman temple, and this is exactly how he drew it. So a kind of far more exact thing than it actually is. So you could say the representation that he's producing is not of the object itself, but of a kind of idea connected to the object, but combined with other things. And I think that is exactly, you could say, what we were interested in producing here. So exactly the same as when the Rolling Stones, after a long night, decide that they're going to drive down to hang around in the Avebury Stones. They too are also recognizing history, but rewriting it in their own image or in their own idealized image. And I suppose that gap between what the world is and how you might re-represent it becomes an incredibly productive space. Which leads me to this: drawing the world makes the world. And I think clearly for us as architects, whose real job is to make drawings which change the world, the act of drawing is an incredibly significant thing. You could say that drawings themselves are ways in which we understand the world. If you look at the paintings, kind of ancient caves, what you see is descriptions of a world which is incredibly different from ours. And I don't mean different in the sense that they don't have mobile phones. I mean different because what they're drawing is different from the things that we would draw. They only draw like creatures. There's no mountains or rocks or trees or rivers. All of the things which we would, I think, first draw if you draw a place, those are the things that we would start to draw. What they drew here was animals and people and positions on the surface of the cave. And sometimes weirder things, dots, which nobody knows what they meant. And sometimes just their own hand as reaching out as if like from a mist behind the cave wall. And clearly at other moments, forms of representation describe worlds which we can recognize, but we don't feel that we belong in. So if you look at like medieval maps, for example, their conception of space is entirely different to the conception of space that we have, as characterized by the way in which we depict the world. Or if you look at, let's say, like Byzantine space, you see an incredible flatness to it. Like we can see there's people there, but we don't understand how that operates as a piece of space. And I think understanding the role that drawing has or images have in our understanding of the space of the world, the conception of the world, the organization of the world is absolutely key to like how architecture operates within the world. And I suppose the question for us is this, this is the question I think is fascinating to us. Our relationship to images has changed like absolutely fundamentally over the last 10 years with the internet. The number of images that we see, the way in which we can call up images from almost any moment in time, breaking down the categories which you would normally find it displayed in the index of a book or in a museum, so that any search, any Google image search will bring up a different set of images if I type it or if you type it, due to the algorithm and the data that they hold about us, but also from time to time. So that grid of images taken out of context, so you don't know really where it's come from. You have to click through to find out what it is or who did it or when it was made. And I think that kind of matrix of a relationship to image and information is a very different one. And I think potentially it produces different ways of thinking about images. So I'm going to show some work I've done with students over the last few years, which have, I guess, played with ideas of what architectural drawing might be, hybridizing different approaches to making images, and using the digital realm both as a technique and as the sort of realm from which these things come, as its media, I suppose. So this was produced along with a set of images at the AA. Now the AA is an interesting school because it's incredibly international. You you have one class of students and you'll have someone from every continent, maybe even Antarctica. And this project sort of used that as a resource. So it paired, say, canonical architectural drawings with folk drawings from wherever the students happen to be. This was John Haydock, John Haydock's wall house, drawn by someone from Turkey. It's a kind of Persian miniature version. This was a slightly different project. This was looking back at fat projects through a similar set of drawing reference. This is an art school we designed in the south of Holland, rendered as if by Piranesi, or a project in the Netherlands, which you'll see a bit later on, drawn in the manner of Mike Webb from Archigram. So these projects are about exploring what digital tools might be as the site of making drawings. So kind of forget renders, but use the act of drawing where almost every line has to be made. It's about, I suppose, de-authoring, so that rather than having the signature sketch, which you might find in Norman Foster or a Frank Gehry, here you're explicitly drawing in the manner of somebody else and finding what might happen in the space between yourself as a kind of constructed social, cultural entity and the drawing, which also has its own issues and ideas of what authorship might be. Sometimes kind of hybridizing in order to produce things which are suggestive of design. So this is the part of the Garden of Versailles as if projected by James Stirling and a worm's eye axonometric of the Flory building, or kind of early spatial stretchings of Zaha type drawings. So I guess in some ways these are little explorations of what it might mean to produce images and maybe also consume images in the age, in a digital age. A clear way of understanding it is to look at how space has constructed the world which we inhabit, or the invention of modern space, which we still, I think, are in, but what that modern space might be. And I would argue, or at least this is an argument, I'm not necessarily saying I believe it, but this argument is that a certain type of space was produced at a certain moment of time and we still live within it, which is why we see some images and understand them spatially, and some images we don't understand them. We don't understand cave paintings, we don't understand Byzantine paintings, but we do understand perspective. And maybe the argument is because we still live in a world governed by the things which perspective was interested in. So measured linear perspective has an origin story itself, which is that what you see here is a diagram that explains it. And so it's a painting of the baptistry in Florence. That's the baptistry in Florence, with a hole drilled in the back of it, with a mirror held up in front of it. And when you look through the hole in the back of the painting, you see the reflection of the painting, and then you see the world, the real world behind you. And at this moment, this experiment proved that linear perspective matched the world. You looked at the reflection of the painting and you looked at the world, and you couldn't see the join anymore. Now, if you read Panofsky in his book, Perspective as Symbolic Form, he argues that that could only happen in Florence at that moment in time because of a certain conception of the construction of the universe. And he argues that's a religious thing. It was a certain idea of what God was, which invented an idea of the infinite, a spatial infinite, which then allowed the vanishing point to emerge. And of course, without the vanishing point, you can't have perspective. But to that, I would add, so this is like, kind of visions of the universe which change representational space, which thereafter go on to change the world. But I'd also add that the other interest of Renaissance Florence was money, was knowing how much everybody had and where it was. So, so that in that conception of a religious idea of space, an earthly idea of knowing and measuring where everything was, you get the possibility of perspective, which of course is exactly what we get when we fire up something like SketchUp. Like, we enter into a world whose parameters are already designed. And this is in an extreme way, but of course we always, as designers, relying on kind of perspectival drawing. And it's not just a tool, it's not just a way that helps us visualize things. It actually is a kind of ideology. It's a drawing as a conception of how the world must be organized. So when you see this, a drawing of absolutely nothing, what this is really a drawing of, it's a drawing of how the world is structured. Just as when you fire up a spreadsheet, it immediately creates a way of organizing the world within a particular idea of how the world should be produced. Now, perspective also has a lot of technicalities, as I'm sure you know. These are slides from Turner's lectures about how to make perspectival drawings. So very abstract spaces with vanishing point, horizon, converging lines on the vanishing point. How you can then construct shapes, three-dimensional shapes within the plane of the paper, how you can add shading to that. So how things move from being abstract to being things which we recognize or imagine as having like qualities of the real, or become architectural, or become pieces of city. And you can see here both the construction lines and the imagination of the city itself. But clearly, it's a very strange world. If you just take a moment to do that very basic experiment that you maybe did as a kid, where you take a piece of paper and draw a line across it, and draw a dot, and then start drawing converging lines, something really weird happens to the piece of paper. It moves from being an object, like a two-dimensional thing, totally flat to something which starts to have pictorial depth. We did a show about this. This is why I'm telling you, of course. We did a show about the power of perspective and trying to understand it as something which goes beyond the page of the drawing. So not just as a form of illustration, but something far more active in constructing us and the world around us. And it dealt with really the weird piece of magic at the heart of a perspectival drawing, which is the vanishing point. And it used a whole set of architectural drawings drawn from about a history of like about 500 years and placed them in relationship to each other. So this is a diagram. We've got two drawings here. On your left, the bottom, is a Super Studio drawing, like very perspectival grid. And top right is a drawing by Palladio in perspective. Very rare, he didn't really like perspective. But the vanishing point from Super Studio positions Palladio. So you have two sets of Italian radicals, like suddenly put into orbit. So this was a kind of about the gravity in the sort of physics sense of the vanishing point, how it can organize things beyond its own frame, and how it might begin to hang, to arrange a hang on a wall, and indeed the way in which the wall itself might become kind of like given depth through a kind of trompe-l'oeil painting, which also obeys the rules and power of the vanishing points which are hung on it. It was a show which began to pair very different kinds of work, either like through chasms of history, Palladio and Super Studio, or between kind of like very different ways of drawing, like incredibly powerful pieces of perspectival drawing, very kind of workaday, like professional architect use of perspective, early drawings which struggle with the concept of perspective, or perhaps are so suspicious of this newfangled invention that they're not convinced that it really draws the world as it is. So this is Smithson, the Elizabethan English architect, kind of, well, I don't know, either presaging cubism or being bad at perspective, your choice. And so you begin to see these clusters of drawings which relate to each other only through the rules of perspective. So here we have Smithson again, bottom left, Super Studio again, Lutyens, a drawing a sort of retrospective drawing from the 17th century illustrating Vitruvius, into wider kind of spider webs of drawings which connect to each other. And you can begin to see also its relationship to the kind of suggested depth that the trompe-l'oeil painting of the wall produces. So in a sense, like this was trying to make visceral the act of perspective, to make you feel as a viewer within the space that somehow things which happen on a page actually begin to organize your body in space. Also begin to change your perception of that space, so that the kind of metrics which we understand normally define positions of or extent of space might also be slightly up for grabs and made more ambiguous. Or ambiguous in a way like this. So although Turner clearly knew all about perspective, we would recognize most of his work as something which is not about perspectival space, even when he's drawing the most kind of cartoon idea of a perspective you can possibly imagine. Train tracks disappearing into the distance. And exactly the moment where the whole thing should hold together is exactly the moment that he obliterates it. You see no horizon, you can't tell which is sky and which is land. You never see the lines converge. And you could say this is a drawing which is about a kind of reaction to, I suppose, a new world. This is the, it's called Rain, Steam, Speed. And it's a steam train. shooting through the landscape, shooting up lots of like smoke. And in a sense, it's the closest that we in Britain ever got to futurism. And maybe the closest we ever got to modernism in a sense of reaction to an industrialized world. Of course, in a very different way to maybe how it happened in other cultures. But this is what Turner was painting, which was like pure engineering, engineering in the landscape. This is Brunel's railway, which ran from London to Bristol, and it did kind of incredible things which had never been done before. It described straight lines across and through the landscape, making tunnels like this. And I think somehow in the way in which, if you compare like this, this to this is the description of exactly the same thing, you can see how forms of representation, I guess, like allow you to understand the world in exactly different, in completely different ways. So equally, perspective is, we often understand it as a way of recording the world, or as professionals, a way of like visualizing moments of the world about to be produced. But it's also, I think, a way of setting other ideas out into space, or even organizing space itself. So one might say, for example, that the tools of like navigation are intimately related to the tools of perspective, like the kind of drawing machines that we see here, for example. The use of mirrors, camera lucidas, camera obscuras, are exactly the same ways in which these navigational devices allowed sailors to find their way across oceans. So in some senses, what you find is the same set of references, the same set of skills, the same forms of knowledge are not only depicting the world, but are actually producing a new organization of the world in terms of like European colonialism and expansion and imperialism. You could say even that forms of like perspectival technology are still the ways in which the world is organized, even though the technology might be different. This is a way in which a battlefield is kind of maintained through like many different forms of like camera readings and the interpolation of that data. Now, of course, often now they're not things that we need to actively see or either point the camera at or to look at the image which is produced, because machines themselves are doing the looking at the world. But I think the thing we should remember is that that act of looking, that act of representation, is the thing which at heart produces the world, even before we as designers engage with it. So to recognize the politics of representation, I think, is absolutely kind of imperative and part of kind of undoing of the kind of powers which control us as much as we control them. Of course, not all forms of representation are pictorial or representational in the same way that perspective is. And space is also a form of code, or is a coded thing. These are a set of drawings which have been produced over, I would say, since about 2011, which have just been given a more public airing through a series of shows. But they're essentially plans, or ostensibly plans, drawn on graph paper with a felt tip pen. But they sort of emerge across the page, almost like a kind of doodle or a kind of stream of consciousness, like one thing, another thing, no composition to them, and full of different, references to very different kinds of things. So what you'll see is incredibly boring, doubly loaded corridors, a kind of most generic form of contemporary construction. Pieces of Mies van der Rohe, football pitches, things which appear to be Baroque churches or fragments of castle or little bits of more monumental structure. Greek temples, trees, picnic rugs. Like, in a sense, a very few set of references which stand for, like, the world, from the domestic to the institutional, from the architecturally important art, historically important, to the mundane, usually in some fragmented form, always produced in relationship to one another, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So these are drawings which are not intended as things which should ever be built. So they're kind of understanding the plan as a form of representation in and of itself, and describing more of a condition than a thing that should be constructed. So plan drawings which exist, I guess, in a lineage much more like this. This is Nolli's famous plan of Rome, which conceived of space in an entirely different way by connecting interior spaces to exterior spaces, producing essentially a pub of the publicness of Rome. Or Piranesi's drawings of Rome, which are part factual, they're part like archaeological, and part historical speculation. Or Archizoom's No Stop City, amazing architectural drawings produced on a typewriter which describe a condition, a spatial condition, rather than a kind of plan of a building. But equally, these kinds of drawings from like Dungeons and Dragons or video games, which are not so much plans, but organizations of narrative in space. Like this, the black here is not poche, it's not something which you would build like a kind of massive wall. It's more a kind of space between particular moments that occur. And clearly this is another kind of organization of the same kind of information as form. So I suppose these kinds of ideas of organization of space that come from the codes of plan have been at the heart of a whole series of exhibition projects that we've been working on recently. This is one for the Victoria and Albert Museum in Shenzhen in China. And it's a space which, the exhibition tells a story about the values of design. It's got like 9 sections, each one organized around a particular value that design creates, like performance, cost, communication, etc., etc. For us, it was interesting to think about like the spatial arrangement of those ideas, of the objects within the show. And I think we can maybe glean from this is a plan which is a kind of a series of fragments. So it's almost like a cathedral. It has a kind of vaguely cathedral-esque plan with chapels to each side, kind of weird, more like exaggerated Baroque moments. But within that fragmented space, each of those moments takes on its own specific character. So just to see what that might produce, like here's an entrance on the diagonal. On the left, you have a dichroic glass wall which changes color as you walk into the space. More of the sort of dichroic which lines a particular section. A kind of viewing area which is like a sort of bastardized portico supported with a tree trunk in the middle of it with a moving message LED sign across the top, so information is absorbed into the architecture itself, where you would, in a classical formation, would have had text carved into the stonework. So it's about kind of like absorption of very different references into a whole series of different spatial moments, which are organized then into a kind of promenade through the space. Or another show, this was at the Design Museum in London, which takes a kind of exaggerated Baroque kind of enclosure, but through the softest of materials. So it's a simple curtain that runs through the space, that creates kind of enclosures, sometimes like very small, sometimes very open. Sometimes you feel like you're inside, sometimes you feel like you're outside. Sometimes it's very dark, sometimes it's very light. And it's cut so that you can kind of wander through it. So it's taking one gesture, the line drawn in plan, and its material quality, like hung through the space, which then produces the variety of like spatial conditions. In the idea of kind of representation, I suppose, is also to do with the idea of looking, like how you see the world. And I just wanted to show you this, partly because we've just finished it, and I thought it would be nice to gauge your reaction. But it's a project for a hairdresser, but it's a kind of weird hairdresser where you, instead of looking in a mirror, you look at art instead. And so your experience is very different from normally getting your hair cut, because you come in and you sit down and you look at something for 20 minutes, half an hour, longer, depending on what you're having done. And so in that experience, you have a very different relationship to the thing that's in front of you. And over time, there's been very different kinds of shows. The kinds of things you're looking at are very different. But it's a space, I think, that we became interested in, like, acts of looking. So, for example, when you don't have mirrors in front of where you expect them to be, we put mirrors where you didn't expect them to be. So mirrors perform spatially. So this is like two sets of mirrors on an internal corner, just like the American bar, so that it kind of feels like infinite space above you. You can see it at the top of the picture there. Kind of frames, which are literal frames, which are also ways of framing work, that frame both the kind of space of culture and the space of commerce. Because, I mean, it's a very small project, but its ambitions are quite, like, laudable in the sense that it's a space that uses the commercial activity of getting a haircut to support the cultural activity, which of course is like a thing that's becoming harder and harder to do. They're also training art students to become hairdressers so that they can support their own cultural practice. They get funding from the Arts Council, but also from L'Oreal. So it's a really interesting kind of mix. And I suppose the architectural response is to try to frame all of those activities within one space. So you can see kind of literal framing with the kind of yellow structure. You can see other kinds of framing and viewing, like a big piece of orange perspex that you see through it, sort of weird structures that interrupt your vision of the art, different ways in which artists and curators have arranged the space, and how you would be set up when you get your hair cut. So it's a space which is really about the act of looking and what happens when you change the rules of how you're supposed to look at something and perhaps also be looked at. The current show we've just curated, so if this is a project which thinks about what a gallery might be or might have to be, we invited a set of architects to kind of invent imaginary museums. You can see a few here. This is by Pup Architects, the big tall thing, so young London architects. Maslon Vrizendorp with the sort of finger, the hand giving you the finger. DKCM in the background. Each of these is a kind of imaginary idea of a museum. This is Fala with some pieces picked up from a building site which become incredibly monumental. OMX with a kind of depot, IKEA meets MoMA. Fraser Muggeridge, a graphic designer who made something a graphic designer would want to make. And so these are, at the moment, the things in the space that you would look at as you're getting your hair washed, as you're waiting for the hair dye to have its effect. as you're getting your hair cut. In work which tries to reach, I guess, across like time and space and to create new things, I'll show you a couple of things. This was produced for a magazine called Cartha, and it's a kind of hybrid between a thing from the like very ancient past again and something from an imagined version of the future. So on your left, the Smithson's House of the Future, which designed in 1965 and imagined to be 1985. And on the right, Skara Brae, which is a Neolithic settlement in Orkney. A most amazing place. You can see a stone dresser and the little beds that they slept in. And somehow there's something really similar between these two structures. And we thought, well, could we not just bring them together? Like the most ancient form of dwelling and, in a sense, a futuristic form of dwelling. All history piled up for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, kind of reworking of the Tribune Tower, like famous for its competition, but also amazing on Michigan Avenue, where it's actually sited with the base of the building is studded with little bits, little fragments of buildings. There's a bit of the Great Pyramids, there's like a piece of Stonehenge, there's a piece of the moon, like somewhere in there. And this is very simply a tower formed out of that catalogue of references, kind of put one on top of another, following the massing logic of Adolf Loos's competition entry. And then I suppose one more? How are you doing? One more? One more, okay. This is a project which deals a little bit with, maybe more directly with some of the ideas that Eric was talking about. Like, this is, I'd say, like, how image can work as infrastructure. So it's a project which is very clearly focused on, like, the kind of the pictorial or representational quality of the building itself, and whose kind of visual quality is drawn from its context, but also in a very extreme and very cheap way. It's a project in the outskirts of Rotterdam for a new town, or what is essentially a new town of Hoogvliet, which was built to serve the refinery you can see at the top of the image. Now, in Dutch terms, at the time that we began working there was a lot of kind of issues with it, with the town. You could say, like, kind of issues of unemployment. Certainly the ways in which the refinery worked was not how it had worked in the 50s and 60s. So the issues around, like, demographics, like young and old, and different communities. It was a project which kind of tried to bring different people together. But first of all, it began as a kind of speculation on forms of identity which you might see within the urban fabric. So here you can see, like, kind of an image which is like 95% Newtown and 5% something else. So a tiny carriage lamp, like, attached to the municipal power supply. So a kind of historical kind of idea, like a kind of thing you would never get put into a new town, or maybe like ways in which particular bits of planting are kind of hung in relation to a front door, which recall very different arrangements or very different ideas or very different kind of symbols. And this was a study of one particular garden, which on the face of it is like completely ordinary, completely dull. On the other hand, once you start to kind of like break it down, you can see the ways in which one garden can tell an incredibly rich story about a particular individual's circumstance. If you begin to see the fence, the different kinds of paving, the pond, the furniture, the topiary, etc., in a very kind of ad hoc and very non-architectural way. But on the other hand, we could understand this as an incredibly sophisticated piece of design. So we made drawings which tried to kind of imagine these things as, let's say, more architectural, you might say. Zooming into what they really might be, what the kind of dream underneath the surface of the suburban landscape might be. Kind of particular references to landscape, and then kind of how architecture might respond to the questions of identity. So whether that's through kind of mega advertising sites, whether it's through like trying to produce architecture which is as communicative and as laden with information as something like Sam Jacob, but purposed for something else rather than the kind of the most important, maybe it's dedicated to vegetable growing competitions. We knew the project would be super cheap, essentially would be this kind of building, the kind of building you can almost order by phone and can get delivered the next day. But we're interested in how this, the most generic and almost most mute form of architecture, might become kind of overwritten or eroded in order to tell other stories, and very specific stories. So there's a kind of question between generic and specific. And as the project developed, it kind of gained a brief, gained a site, gained a budget, and became a kind of cultural centre, community centre, and a park with particular facilities in it. It's all development. So it became something like this, which has like large bits of landscaping, producing a kind of miniature mountain range, a lake in the shape of Holland, a kind of negative flooded Holland, a grand patio, and a building called the Villa, which sits in the middle of it. And this is what you begin to see. So it's kind of almost like a kind of super cheap picturesque, I might say, the sort of idea of the picturesque, the follies in the landscape, a kind of idea of narrative, but produced in a very municipal manner. So the structures which are holding very kind of ordinary activities, like here a model boat club, in a shed which somehow dreams it was maybe more important than itself, or a bridge to the children's playground in the kind of mud and reeds that is like a half-built house, or the sign to the arboretum, which is like garden fence meets motorway sign, or the furniture, which is part just abandoned log and part like horribly treated, industrial, coated, like cultured seat, or bridges which connect the park to the town, which are literal information, they're kind of made out of words, or the building itself, which, though simple in form, becomes rich in its kind of narrative content. What you see here is an entrance which is like big golden trees. You see wood like applied to the front in a apparently ad hoc manner, which refers to the chimneys of the Shell refinery behind, which produces a kind of almost like a kind of billboard building to one side, and which on its elevation towards the park becomes much more kind of broken down, a different scale, but treated here with a kind of single super graphic. Like imagine if, like, so this, yeah, I guess this is like Tex Avery meets Mies van der Rohe, at least in my mind, a certain precision and abstraction, yet at the same time a kind of almost like cartoon super graphic to it, which describes the landscape which surrounds the building. So from left to right, kind of bits of infrastructure of the port of Rotterdam, the abundance of nature, little bits of housing, pulled off the building on this side, so it becomes a kind of spatial device, or opening up at the corner where the cafe is. So these like cut out, like stage set trees become actual like objects in the park. Lampposts, which are part tree, part chimney, and then an interior which is like the most kind of basic sports hall you could possibly imagine. Maybe the only kind of design elements as the pink intumescent paint on the steelwork, and these glimpses of the layering of the facades which happened to the outside. Turned out it was an amazing choice to make pink intumescent paint, because there's a lot of weddings which happen in the building, and it's kind of a building which has is a sort of backdrop for an incredible amount of community events. So in a sense, it's the image which is the kind of infrastructure. It's a sort of like production of could say a kind of new form of civic language, the kind of thing which architecture often does not want to engage with, because it's on the one hand interested in a project of abstraction, i.e. a non-narrative kind of surface, but also maybe because they're questions which suddenly have like big political consequences. So on the one hand, you could say like a kind of fun cartoon. On the other hand, like what would you choose to represent for a community or for a place if you have to make those decisions, and how could it work against all of these different circumstances? So here you really see it becoming like theatrical backdrop. So it's an interesting way to think of like how an image can begin to work as like an important functional piece of like community infrastructure. Completely the opposite. This is like a building which we're about to take on site, but was also just after FAT broke up. So it was a kind of like, this is like the difficult album after a after a breakup. And it's in sort of central-ish London. You can see the sort of context, which is on the one hand very vernacular, very brick, very Victorian, but also you can see on the right like 1950s 10-story housing blocks, on the left a Victorian school, and this building on the end here, which is a kind of accident of bombing and planning. It used to be part of a long terrace, but the rest of the terrace has vanished, and actually around the site somebody at some point drew a U-shape. So this was a project which was kind of rejecting, in a sense, exactly those things in Rotterdam, this kind of idea of decoration, idea of communication, and tried to almost do nothing at all, or respond only to the site itself. So really it's a U-shaped building which is full of U-shapes itself. So it's a U-shape in its plan, it goes right to the edge of the boundary of the site, it repeats that as it steps back, and it repeats it again on the roof, and it repeats it on its interior too. So it was a kind of, like it was this project, which has been around for about, I guess, like 5 years. It was kind of it was a question of like how might other forms of representation like take the place of that more direct kind of visual narration. In this case, how might this kind of urban context and its urban kind of formation simply be the thing which is repeated in order to produce its own quality? But I suppose, I mean, these maybe are the questions which the talk is thinking about, or the work is thinking about. It's like, how much do we construct architecture, or how much does architecture construct us? Whether they're thought about in these projects, probably not, but there's certainly things you can buy, which are architecturally themed, like bits of clothing, a half-timbered t-shirt, or insulation scarf, or a scale bar scarf. These are moments where, let's say, things you expect to exist within one medium, whether that's drawing, building, transfer to another, into like the identity that we choose to like cover our own bodies with. And I suppose this is the other way, like a lot of the work, I suppose, tries to imagine how architecture might learn from things outside of kind of architecture, and these are moments where architecture invades the rest of the world. But I suppose deep down, really what this is saying is that everything is a form of representation. There's no difference between like the drawing and the building and the model. These are all parts of the production of architecture. And that even what we usually consider as real and like the actual world which we inhabit is simply another form of representation. Are we like these guys in one reality looking at another, being looked at by another? And once we try to understand all architecture as representation, then perhaps there are questions we can ask of it which we cannot ask if we understand it as a real, a kind of a real thing which has its own parameters. Once it becomes something which is as flimsy as a model or as a drawing, then it's something that we can intervene within. Thank you very much.
Des questions? Ok. Sébastien, des questions? Huh? Well, thank you. I think it's a strange section about what is architecture from this point of view representation. It's a pity our students most involved in those issues cannot be there. Of course, it's not really a question, it's just a comment for students about the fact that I think taking the tools of architecture as the drawing, as you do, perspective or drawing, well, representation of architecture itself, to produce buildings, but not considering those representation means as simple tools, but really questioning the fact that when you choose to make a model, or when you choose to make a perspective or just a flat drawing and so on, of course, you don't have only a tool in your hand, but you have not only a tool to represent, but a tool to really think about things. And I think it's really important for our students to be aware of this. And for sure that you were very few architects actually investigate or have investigated representation and relationship between architecture and representation to the level you do it through such your work and such a lecture. So I think for this is really great, really interesting. And also the fact that this way you also can produce almost automatic buildings. You work through a process, through ideas, really assuming that architecture is above all ideas. And also the fact that this way you take a process and you reach a certain result, and of course I guess in the end you have a critical relationship to this result, and if you keep the result it's because of course you think it's good, but in a way it's almost an automatic way of creating building by mixing the U shape, the U house by Ito with the Melnikov one, for example. And of course all this is beyond all this actually creates a kind of specific aesthetic, and which what I appreciate is the kind of thing. I think it's not possible to draw this from a scratch in your notebook. It's only an architecture that comes from process and a series of ideas brought one with the other. So I think this is the most important for our students to understand, that projects are always done this way, in a way. I mean, only by bringing ideas, not by just designing most of the contemporary architecture has fallen into a kind of design for the sake of design. Many buildings are very well designed in a way. Let's say they are nice, beautiful rarely, I think, but they are kind of pleasant to look at. But they don't have any substance. I mean, of course, such projects are full of intentions and full of substance and full of ideas in a very, and it shows also in which way a theoretical approach can lead you to real things. And that's the bad thing. For example, the last project we saw, of course, when you quickly see this on Instagram, you can think it's just the joke of the day, for example. But actually, when you look at them, of course, more precisely, you understand it's something different. And now, I never had seen those pictures with the people inside used. Then it really gives the real dimension of those buildings. And then you understand it's not a joke at all. It's really something seriously involved in the life of this community. It's really kind of shocking to see the difference of appreciation we can have of the building with nobody inside and with the building with people inside. I mean, of course, it's often like this. If you consider Lacaton Vassal's building, of course, you understand it will be interesting to have people inside. But when you look at this building with no people, it doesn't seem it will be so more relevant with the people inside.
I mean, yeah, I love that one, which is just like rubbish outside. It's like such a great picture. You know, like which one was it? Like, where's it going?
Okay. So thanks a lot, Sam. It was brilliant. Really.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.